I'm James Brierson. Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group, streaming live on Facebook and YouTube on this Wednesday, June 18th, 2025. Our guest this week is former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate, who's going to be talking to us about his thoughts on the state of his former agency, an agency that has been in the headlines in recent weeks. If you have a comment or question for him, go ahead and throw it in our chat as we begin this live episode of the Carolina Weather Group. Let's roll that open. We're very excited to have you back on the show, former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate. Thank you again for your time and coming back to the Carolina Weather Group.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Our audience is hopefully familiar with you from your previous appearances on our show, including your reveal of the behind-the-scenes story of the Waffle House Index. But we have you on this week to talk about the state of your former agency. You wrote a column earlier this year. You co-authored a column that was in the Tampa Bay Times. It was headlined 3 Ways President Trump Can Improve FEMA's Disaster Response. Since then, we've seen other headlines involving the president, including this one just this week from CNN, where the president says that he plans to phase out FEMA after the 2025 hurricane season. And we thought of no one better than you, Craig, to come on and give us a good, honest take on the state of that agency. But before I get to my first question, I think it's important for our audience who maybe doesn't know you. We have a lot of new audience. You served under both Republicans and Democrats in your career. Is that right?
Right. I was appointed by Governor Jeb Bush to be the director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management, and under him, we 2004, 2005, we were rather busy. 4 hurricanes in 2004, and about that many in 2005. So when I was asked to join the Obama administration, they honestly thought I was a Republican. They didn't even know I was a Democrat. So I stay pretty apolitical, which is why when people try to get me to do opinions on the policy piece of it, I try to stick to what I think are factual things, or I take people and listen to what they're saying, and my response is based upon what I think that's possible, what could be done.
Yeah, we can see some of the pictures behind you for audio listeners. Craig, in addition to having a fabulous looking typewriter, has pictures of you with former President Obama, and then a newspaper clipping. Is that from your time leading the state agency in Florida?
No, that was when I was a county director.
Okay.
In Gainesville.
Well, that's really good experience that you have to share with our audience tonight, both on a county, a state, and a federal level, because we know that's one of the questions and debates and topics that has come up with regards to FEMA. Here, of course, in the Carolinas, the agency has been on the ground since Helene and has been beloved by some and criticized by others. In the Tampa Bay Times piece that you co-authored earlier this year, you highlight that FEMA is doing many things right, in your opinion. What do you think the biggest misconceptions are that you might hear in the public or from the media about FEMA's role in disaster response, Craig?
Well, the first thing is, and what the president's saying isn't anything new about it. It's always, the governors that are leading this with, the locals on the ground. I think we've kind of built up in the national media and the public that FEMA is a response organization that is coming in to respond to these disasters, take over, that they should be seen on the ground, rescuing people and doing all this stuff. And FEMA's job on behalf of the president when he declares a disaster is really to support the governor and the governor's team. And in many cases, that may be limited to providing financial assistance to help pay for that response. And so when you see a lot of these people out in the field, the National Guard, other people, and you're going, where's FEMA? It's like, well, first of all, the job's getting done by the state resources. FEMA is coordinating the reimbursement, and never think that it's FEMA's money. It's your money. This is federal tax dollars. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception that people have, is that FEMA shows up and solves all the problems, where the reality is FEMA's job on behalf of the president is coordinate the federal response in support of the governor, where the governor has identified the need, where he wants FEMA to come in. And quite honestly, for a lot of disasters, that's really about financial recovery assistance.
Craig, in the piece that you wrote, and I know you've written one more recently in Bloomberg too, but I'll let our audience know that they can find a link to the Tampa Bay piece and a QR code in the top right corner of the screen. You recommend to convert certain public assistance projects into fixed cost block grants. I'm not familiar with, I guess, if a block grant is different than a usual grant. So I'll ask you to explain that to me. But what would that process look like if your suggestion were taken up, and how would the accountability process work with that?
Well, this is the complexity of our recovery system. Congress, and again, FEMA administers a statute called the Stafford Act. A lot of people think about FEMA as it's FEMA administering the Stafford Act, and that is the recovery programs that are turned on when the president declares a disaster. And that program, it was written back in the 80s. It's been updated, but it's primarily designed to address uninsured losses. Now think about that. Your federal tax dollars are being used for uninsured losses. And that makes perfect sense when we're talking about response costs, calling out the guard, ordering up water, getting generators, running shelters, evacuations, things like picking up debris. And these are things that you just wouldn't insure. But the majority of your tax dollars are actually going to public buildings, fire stations, community centers, courthouses, schools. And these are buildings that many times local and state governments are self-insured. They don't really have any insurance. And so when a disaster occurs, they'll apply for FEMA. And what we were recommending is, because the initial goal of the Stafford Act was not to supplant or replace insurance, but where there were insurance gaps, only pay for the actual loss. And that term has resulted in FEMA having to go into and a fire station is the best way to describe this. If you have a fire station today under the current program that gets destroyed, let's say these tornadoes that have been occurring recently, and it didn't have insurance, and you got declared, and you're that county, and the tornado caused the damage, FEMA would go in with the state, locals. The locals would put in an application. FEMA and the state would review it and determine, yes, this is a fire station. It is owned by a nonprofit or by government. It was destroyed. They don't have insurance, so we're gonna agree to replace that fire station. Well, now this is done on a reimbursement process. So now the local and state have to figure out what they want to do and scope it. FEMA has to approve that, because there's going to be questions about, we can only replace what was there. If you want to put an extra bay on the fire station, the federal taxpayer won't pay for that. If you decide you want to relocate that fire station, that's an alternative project. That's a whole nother can of worms you got to go through. And as you go through this and you actually start building the fire station, FEMA will have to inspect and make sure work's taking place, and they'll release some more money. That process can take 5 years or more.
Wow.
What we're recommending is you treat it more like an insurance policy, where you go in, you agree on the front end, it is destroyed, it was the disaster, you don't have insurance. You go and get an engineer or architect to come up with the damage, what it would cost to fix it or rebuild it, and put their seal on it. And FEMA would look at that number and go, yes, that makes sense, but we want to add some more mitigation. We want to make sure it survives next time. And then we're done. We agree to that number. You get the check at 75% of the total value of the project, which is what it is on the reimbursement process. But now, instead of taking 5 years to get the fire station paid for, they got the money on the front end. So now if they need to move it, add a bay, whatever, they're able to do that without having to go back to FEMA and FEMA having to review all that stuff. And it means that you should be able to, on the federal taxpayer side, obligate the money. It will still take them a while to build a fire station, but the obligation of your federal tax dollars will be on the front end, and you're done. And you get rid of the overhead of monitoring this contract and reimbursing it on every one of these. And so it acts more like a grant, where we agree there's damage, there's a number, we agree to the number, we write you the check, and the federal side is done. Now, when you ask about accountability, because this is federal money, they would still be required to follow federal procurement law, and they still have to comply with the Single Audit Act requirements for any federal dollars. So they still got to count for the money, and there's checks and balances in there to make sure that the money's not used in ways that would be illegal. But it does give local governments more flexibility to actually address their needs and understand that the share of the federal taxpayer has been determined. And people have said, well, what happens if we miss something? What if we do this and we turn out something even more? And because we agreed to a low number, what we're finding, FEMA would actually have paid for that. And I'm like, that's why you want the architect or engineer of record signing off on it, because they carry liability insurance, because they're the ones that wrote up the project. And if they miss something, they have insurance for that.
Craig, you mentioned how long the timelines could be and a lot of the overhead. I think you mentioned 5 years. We're in 2025 now. 2020 was a very active hurricane season. Just to help our audience visualize this, are there disasters beyond Helene? Are there disasters that you can think of that are still ongoing that really paint how long that process takes?
Hurricane Katrina.
Wow. Okay. 20 years, right?
When I was, 20-year anniversary, but when I was in FEMA, my last year, 2016, and this was in 2005, so 11 years later, we were still signing off on over $1 billion worth of work on the water and sewage board of sewer lines that had been damaged by the storm. So, and we were going with actual costs, and we actually used the tool we got after Superstorm Sandy to essentially do it as a estimate and write a check and be done with it. And turned out to be a very big check, but it was interesting that we agreed to a process. We did the analysis with the state and the city and the water and sewage board. I can remember the mayor thought the number was way too low. My staff thought it was way too high. I figured it was about right. But we had a methodology where we had an independent engineering firm that came up with a methodology. We agreed to that, and then we applied it to the system, and it gave us that estimate. And it allowed us to write that check and allow the water and sewage board to get on the repairs. And again, that's going to take a long time, but we're not in there constantly having to monitor and improve and keep, putting just a lot of process. And this would significantly reduce the size and requirement for FEMA's workforce. Not so much the permanent workforce, but the recovery workforce that can swell to as many as 20,000 people when we're having a lot of disasters. So we could do this with fewer people, and in doing that, they would have more experience. We'd get in faster. State and local governments would get their money faster. And a lot of things that the president heard, and the frustration that I've always heard, is the quote-unquote red tape. Part of that is the accountability of it. But if we can move towards this idea of, as the president said, a block grant, where we can just go in there and do a cost estimate, it would be much faster. I think the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse doesn't get any worse with this. In fact, in many cases, I think it actually lessens that. And it gives flexibility back to state and local government so they can focus on rebuilding, not going through this tremendous grant administration process. And the actual committee in Congress which oversees the Stafford Act and a lot of FEMA activities is the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And they've actually put out a draft bill that has actually taken a lot of these ideas, and they worked on some other things and have a draft legislation out there for people to comment on. But their overall goal was to provide a faster way of getting cities, counties, and states reimbursed and maintaining accountability. So the one thing that's a little different than I think some of the things where people say we're just going to give the state a block grant for the full amount, which can get really difficult to make sure that money's going where it needs to go, is do it by projects. And it doesn't have to be by a fire station. If you had, like in Charlotte County, they lost all their fire stations in Hurricane Charlotte. You just write one project for all the fire stations. You just add it all up, because I'm not sitting there doing reimbursement on them rebuilding 7 fire stations. We could come up with the total amount and give them that check. And now they can get the efficiencies of now having the money up front to go do the work. And again, it's a cost share. Most of this is 75-25. Sometimes it'll go up to 90, 100. The only time you really see 100% these days is really on the initial response, what we would call emergency protective measures, and then picking up debris.
So how do you think the agency is doing right now?
They're going through a massive loss of experience. And that again, I find it interesting. They're going to keep FEMA going until the end of hurricane season as if between now and then something miraculously going to happen. But I actually went to the National Hurricane Center, our National Hurricane Conference this year for the 20th anniversary of Katrina. I said, could you not be political? And I said, sure. So I described 2005. And what people forget, the backstory was Secretary Chertoff had ordered a what they call stage 2 review of DHS and the components. And one of the recommendations was to take FEMA apart, pull all the preparedness programs, all the training programs, the grants, everything, and put it into another directorate and leave FEMA just doing response and recovery, essentially Stafford Act. And not even really running the response. That was going to be the National Operations Center at DHS. So this is prior to Hurricane Katrina. The other thing that had happened was FEMA had funded a full-scale exercise in 2004 called Hurricane Pam, which was, most accounts, a very realistic exercise that broke a lot of things. And the state's intent was, we want to see where things are going to go wrong, where we have weaknesses. And that was supposed to be followed up in the spring of 2005 with a second exercise on Hurricane Pam to actually now start working through what they were going to do differently. That funding got swept by DHS, and that exercise never took place. Also in 2005, you had a new governor of Louisiana, you had a new mayor in the city, you had a new state emergency management director, and we had a forecasted above average hurricane season. And a lot of the people that had responded in the 04 hurricanes in Florida, because of all this stuff going on with DHS taking FEMA apart, had left. Draw your own conclusions. You know, if this something that would resemble 2025, because we got a new mayor in New Orleans, we have a new governor, we have a new state emergency management director, FEMA's in turmoil, morale is bad, and it's above average hurricane season. And I think it's optimistic. I don't know, it could happen, but I think it's optimistic that people think that we can shift all this to the states and it's not going to have blowback on the administration if things go wrong. In the case of the Bush administration, it didn't stay with the state. It blew back on the president. Same thing happened to his father with Hurricane Andrew. And again, there was culpability at the state and local level, but the national perception was they held the president accountable. And that's always been the tension of, yes, governors are supposed to be in charge, or they are in charge. They're supposed to be running this. But when there's failures, the national perception is the president somehow failed. And that was an understanding when I went to work for President Obama, was my job is to make sure states don't fail. And I think it's a different approach than we're going to come in and take over.
It sounds to me, Craig, like you're saying history repeats itself, or there are lessons to be learned from history.
Well, I've been in this business long enough to see that almost every disaster, I see recurring themes that we just don't seem to learn. We got to the point now where we said lessons learned, they're more like lessons observed because we keep repeating them. And
can you tell us some of those lessons that come to mind?
All right, every time you have a disaster, what's the number one issue that everybody always raises?
Housing and trailers.
Communications.
That one works too.
Like and none of this is really new. But I think because we get so much churn and separation from events, and the memory is short, and we keep seeing similar things happening over and over again. And I think that's why, you know, I really look at all this stuff and I sit back and kind of go, we spend so much time on process, we forget why we're here. And it's like even emergency management. I've said, we grew up saying we prepare, we respond, we recover, we mitigate. We throw terms in there like resilience. We build all this process. We never tell people what we do. We warn people. We coordinate evacuating people. We coordinate sheltering people. We coordinate a multi-agency response when it exceeds any one agency, especially on life safety. We coordinate with infrastructure restoration. We coordinate on getting debris picked up. And for emergency managers, about the only thing we actually really do many times is we're the alert originator for activating the emergency alert system. But most everything else, our job is on behalf of the chief executive officer, mayor, or county commissioner, or whoever has that authority, to coordinate the rest of the team on these complex issues that no one agency is able to resolve by themselves. And so rather than a bunch of agencies trying to fix all this stuff, we work as a team. and emergency management's job is to coordinate that. But the public, when you say we prepare, we respond, we mitigate, all this stuff, is like, really? We warn you. We plan for and coordinate evacuations. Some are coastal, some are flash floods, some are wildfires. We coordinate sheltering. Some of that's short term, some of that's long duration. We work with the responders to make sure they've got what they need to get out there and complete search and rescue and secure areas quickly. And if they don't, make sure we've got requests going up to the next level to bring those resources in, either through mutual aid, state assistance, or ultimately the state asking for the federal government. This is, I think we spend so much time talking about that. So it's quite natural when we're always talking about process and things, people are looking at this and going, what are you guys doing? And I don't think we do a good job of saying, here's our priorities. One, we got to get to you. Second thing is search and rescue. And until we get search and rescue done, we're not doing anything else. So all the stuff you thought we should be doing on day 3 or 4 may be not happening because our thin little, line of getting into the areas are devoted to search and rescue. And we don't have any capacity to add other stuff there because of either roads or lack of access or having to fly teams in. And I think that's it. To me, it's really important that we talk so broadly. You got to be very specific because people in the communities, I think, are very tolerant of not everything being fixed right away. But if they know what the plan is and you're updating them, okay, first thing is going to be search and rescue, folks. Second thing is going to be getting critical supplies into the most vulnerable parts of the community. And if you've done your thing and gotten ready and prepared, don't be showing up in line competing with people that don't have anything. We got to get the roads open because not much is going to happen until that's going on. And it's like giving people the cadence of, and I would basically, when people start talking about FEMA, I'm like, all FEMA is doing right now is providing either what we call direct federal assistance, maybe deploying urban search and rescue teams, which are all over the country that FEMA sponsors and bringing them in, or maybe it's, U.S. Public Health Service with a disaster medical assistance team, or maybe it's one of FEMA's communication units, or it's generators from the Corps of Engineers. But in general, if you see FEMA in the first couple of days doing stuff, I would really question if they're FEMA employees. FEMA is really sitting in that EOC with that governor's team. And if we're getting out there that quick, it's probably not a response operation. It's more of a recovery operation. And that's the other thing I think people have a hard time distinguishing, that you don't want to start your recovery stuff when you still have people missing. And when I talk recovery, I'm basically talking about the financial assistance piece. And so, I mean, again, I get where the perception is, and I've learned a long time ago that in some cases presence is a mission. If you're not seeing it, it's assumed you're not there. But I think it's also important that FEMA can't get ahead of the governor. That we're there to support the team. I'm not going to let, when I was director, we're not going to let a governor fail, but we're not getting in front of the governor.
We've been, as you've been talking, playing some video from Hurricane Helene response here in the Carolinas. And I'll fast forward a little bit because as you were talking about the governor and the FEMA response, this is specifically when FEMA was visible in Asheville. I think that was where I had the video queued up. I apologize. It's not rolling right now, but I remember, the FEMA director was there. The state governor was there. I'm going to ask you in a minute, Craig, a question about resilience, which I know is a passion of yours and something you hit upon in your last response. But you also talked about a loss of experience that's going on right now with FEMA, and we've seen with other federal agencies. Our audience probably most familiar with NOAA and the National Weather Service, who I guess you could argue probably also has a little bit of a marketing public perception problem. And that's what I wanted to ask you about was, do you think some of this is not unique to FEMA when it comes to just being transparent, being visible with the public and the public understanding all of the ins and outs of what they do?
Yeah, I mean, with National Weather Service, I don't know how many people I dealt with up on Capitol Hill that thought they could get that from the Weather Channel or AccuWeather and all the other private services. And I'm like, you do know that they depend upon the forecast products, the models, and the data observations of the National Weather Service. And they were like, well, no, they do all that stuff. And I'm like, no, they don't.
Right.
And even the private weather service providers will tell you they're very concerned about the degradation in these observation systems because they depend upon that to then be able to add their value to that data. And that data is not something that any of them are really prepared to do on their own. And so I think there's some of the stuff where, people think that, well, if the weather service went away, we still got all the private meteorologists. And I'm like, yeah, but you do understand that's a symbiotic relationship. In many ways, they become amplifiers for the weather service's products. But without the weather service products, they have very little to work with.
Yeah, I think we can speak for all of us here. I mean, that's what we do here on a regular basis, honestly, is to be that force multiplier. The weather service gets their products out and they rely on the media. They rely on, people on the ground to get that message out. And I think, might be something that we almost take for granted. So you write that state and local governments, they need to have some skin in the game. And we've talked about that some here already. I think, one of the questions, especially, I'm in Charleston, we have a resilience. We certainly have a need for resilience against things like flooding and things like that. So what is the most realistic way to get local officials to invest in that resilience before disaster strikes, and especially in those lower income communities?
Pay very close attention to what this administration is saying and what other people are saying about the shift of the financial responsibility from the federal taxpayer balance to the state and locals. They're not saying they're not going to help, but you saw there's been memos out of quadrupling 4 times the current threshold. So for Charleston, a lot of stuff up. Resiliency and climate change and mitigation are phrases that are running into tremendous headwinds. The administration has already eliminated the building resilient infrastructure in communities, so that was a big fraud, waste of money. And for local governments, I think one of the biggest things they need to be paying attention right now is ensuring and insurability of their vulnerable structures. Because if you're not getting declared for disasters, that's going to come out of the public purse. And if you don't have insurance, it's going to be hard to rebuild. And I think this tendency for smaller, more reoccurring threats where everybody's so leveraged to they need a federal disaster declaration, I think they need to take a step back and go, we're going to have to take on more financial responsibility. So I was talking to some people, this whole thing about building resilient infrastructure in communities, it's a great idea, but how do you measure it? And people say, well, for every dollar we invest, we get a $9 return. I said, that's a potential return. Unless it's hit in a disaster, we don't know. So why don't we call it something else? Why don't we talk about building and sustaining insurable communities? Why don't we focus on making improvements to make sure that flood insurance is affordable and available? Why don't we make sure that our building codes and land use planning are attractive to insurance companies? Why aren't we looking at building our public infrastructure in a way that is less likely to fail, really focusing on the function of that and using either pooled insurance or private insurance? But why are we not doing more to be financially ready for disasters, which may or may not get declared going forward?
So, Craig, one thing I'm curious about, talking about how we might want to do things differently, since that seems to be the big conversation these days. Suppose, kind of from your armchair quarterback position that you're in these days, if you could, have any tool that you wanted, that money's no option, and you could exercise mind control over Congress and state legislatures, what would be one tool that you wish that you could have in your toolbox, either at the federal or state level, that you don't have right now?
Permanent repairs on damaged individual homes. Because this is a huge frustration, and this is classic. FEMA interprets the Stafford Act as written that they can't do permanent work for homes that are damaged. They can only do enough to shelter. And that may mean putting people up in hotel and motel rooms for 18 months. That could mean bringing a travel trailer or a mobile home for 18 months. Some of those solutions will cost several $100,000. Where if I just went in and fixed the roof and made some improvements where I could get the power turned back on, people could move in, it maybe only be $50,000 or $60,000. And now people are back in their home and not displaced. And So the current bill that House Transportation and Infrastructure is floating out there would actually allow for that. And it's a tricky position because a lot of people, and again, the Stafford Act, this framework that we use for all this disaster systems, was really built upon insurance would be the first payee, and the federal taxpayer would be a backup, not a primary. So when you start saying you're going to start fixing homes, is that creating a moral hazard where more and more people won't have insurance? And the answer is I don't think so, because mortgages generally require that. What we're talking about are people who homes have been passed down through generations. They don't have insurance. They're low income, and we could go in there and do permanent work. And I'm not saying we're going to fix the house back up better than it was. I'm saying we'll do enough work to get the power back on. And if they put a red tag from the building official saying you can't live there till repairs are made, do enough repairs where it's safe to move back. And don't put people up in a hotel and motel for 18 months and then their house still hasn't been fixed. And so that's something that I always wanted. We turned ourselves into pretzels. We started this in Superstorm Sandy up in New York, and we followed this through in the flooding in Louisiana in 2016, where we took sheltering. We called it shelter in place. We're sheltering them in their homes. But instead of just slapping a blue tarp up there, we actually made enough repairs where, like in New York, it was important we had to have heat because we were going right into the cold weather right after that. And Baton Rouge, we had to get air conditioning because if you don't have air conditioning, you can't dehumidify, and the mold's just going to take over. And you need to get enough basic things in there where they have sanitation, they can cook. But we were able to get that program, but it was very difficult. There was a lot of internal pushback because it's a very high risk to go in and do this. But what we found was the faster we can get in there and get people back in their homes, the better chance communities have of maintaining their tax base and the better chance people have of being able to recover. And again, the goal here is not to supplant insurance and not to hold people, harmless. They're going to have skin in the game because this will only be a partial, but it will be enough to make sure it's safe enough that the electrical company will hook up. If you got gas, the gas company will hook up, and the building officials will say it's safe enough to move back in.
Craig, would you apply the same argument to building back better, maybe higher up a hill or higher up on stilts or whatever it might be to make that home more disaster proof?
Yeah, but that would be if it was destroyed. If it's just damaged, we're not at 50%, we'll patch it. But that's where I think the other thing we've got to really focus on is where and how we build in our building codes and the difference that can make. And where we are using your tax dollars, we ought to not just build it back to where it failed. And so there's a big difference between what I would call repairing and then the long-term solution. And that oftentimes will be with community block grant dollars. This is one of the things that North Carolina's had several times where they've gotten HUD dollars to go in and repair and rebuild homes for permanent work. And in some cases, replace homes that were destroyed. And they're looking at doing that in the Helene environment. But those programs take about 2 to 3 years to get spun up and actually start working. So my goal would be for FEMA is just get it to where it's safe to move back in. And then we need to look at these other programs. And that may be the National Flood Insurance Program, where either we do targeted buyouts or we do elevations when we look at the long term. But, particularly for public buildings, we really got to get out of this mindset of we're just looking at the value of the structure. We got to really look at the function, because the value of a fire station is the cost of building the fire station. But the value of the function is it's a response node in the community during a crisis. And if that fire station is taken out by a disaster, I've not just lost a building. I lost an entire public safety for that area. And now I'm having to bring resources from the outside, which will take longer to get there. And I've degraded that response at the time the community needs it the most. So, part of the things I really try to get people to think about is, although I would say these things would, we'd almost look like an insurance. You come in and you adjust and you pay. You always got to also build into that. Are we putting enough money back into it that we can ensure that the function will be able to operate? And my sense is, knowing that, it'll also be much easier to insure. An example, all the fire stations in Charlotte County got destroyed in the 2004 hurricane. based upon FEMA's cost-benefit analysis and mitigation for the buildings, they were not willing to go back to a higher code. They were basically going to go back and meet the Florida building code. And we're going, but they got destroyed. They're going, yeah, but it only, we're only, the cost-benefit analysis says we can only go back and build it back to the code, which would be an improvement. But they got hit with a Cat 4 and it exceeded the building code. And I'm like, I want to build them to 200 mile an hour because I want this thing to be here. And we're going to rebuild the fire stations anyway. And yes, it's an increased cost, but it's not as expensive as losing that fire station and the equipment and the personnel, because preferably the fire station is intact, ready to go, survives the hurricane, is your first units out doing rescues. You're going to save lives doing that. But I think too often the way these programs I've always looked at, they just look at the cost of the building instead of what's the function.
You have praised some of the executive orders President Trump has signed in his second administration here, kind of his first steps. As we wrap up our interview tonight, I'm curious to hear from you. Is there one thing you think is working really well? And is there one thing that you think needs to be changed before this hurricane season wraps up?
The one thing I think is working is we finally got a debate where the very mention that we ought to be shifting more of the financial responsibility for smaller recurring disasters back to the state is not immediately shut down by every advocacy group, every governor, and every member of Congress screaming not to do that. And in the Obama administration, we tried to do it through deductibles. This is a debate we've needed to have. It's moved too far to the federal taxpayer where it's almost like a default that you as a federal taxpayer are going to pay for building codes, zoning decisions that are made at the local and state level that you have no control over. It's too easy to go and get these disasters. I'm not saying that, we should make it so draconian we never declare disasters, but I remember the late Senator Tom Coburn, who was senator from Oklahoma. I got to be good friends with him. He was a Republican, but and also known by his colleagues as Dr. No. And he routinely would not support the state of Oklahoma's request for disaster declarations because he said that they should be able to manage that until we had the more tornadoes. And I was on the ground with him and he was looking at that response and he looked at me and said, Craig, that's why we made FEMA. This is what FEMA is here for. They're not here for the routine floods or the small tornado that hits an insured community. It's these events where as a nation, we need to support each other. And I thought it was a good example of him having to be able to frame that most disasters that a state got declared for, he really felt the state should have been able to manage that. But he also saw more as, and this is why we have a federal emergency management agency, because when it's this bad, we need to come together as a nation and support states and local communities.
Well, we appreciate your insight, and you're always willing to share your time with our audience here at the Carolina Weather Group. That's former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate, and I'm going to go ahead and put the link up on the screen one more time if you want to go read the Tampa Bay column that he co-wrote earlier this year. And Craig, where can people find you if they want to continue to see your take on current headlines?
Look me up on LinkedIn. I'm posting a little bit more. Also, just Google me. I do a lot of interviews. Most recently is an article in Bloomberg that addresses many of these issues. As most people know, I really try to stay away from good and evil when you're talking politics. There's things I don't agree with. There's things I agree with. I try to really look at it from the standpoint of, yes, we can make this better. Are there things that are not helping? Are there things that could help? In some ways, I think it's just we're moving a conversation where it needed to go that we were too reluctant to have before. But I also think there's some important relevance to making sure that we fix things, not just break things.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate your time as always. Please come back and talk with us again real soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. We have a few minutes left on tonight's program, and before we go, we do have some, I'm going to call it relative breaking news to share with our audience. We did have a major development in Western North Carolina today in an area that does not need to see pictures like this because it is way too reminiscent of some of the pictures we saw after Helene. But this is video right there at the North Carolina and Tennessee state line on I-40. A thunderstorm dumping 2 inches of flash flooding rain in the course of about half an hour, causing a mudslide. And so at this hour, I-40 is closed. You'll probably remember that we've only had 1 lane open in each direction, and that is only going back about a month or so because the interstate was heavily damaged during Helene. Well, that interstate is closed again tonight because here's a still picture. You can see we had cars stuck in the water. We had debris flow. I'm looking at what looks like trees, guys, right here at the state line. Exit 451, I think, might be the first exit on the Tennessee line. They have been working to get all these vehicles out of there, but right now I-40 remains closed at the North Carolina and Tennessee state line. And you can just see in some of this eyewitness video the way the water is coming rushing down the terrain. Frank, I know you went up to Asheville and shared with our audience here on the Carolina Weather Group a couple weeks back, met with a lot of scientists who discussed a lot of things, but I think things like this, landslides and the way the water flows down the terrain, I mean, this could almost look like video from Helene if we weren't telling you that the video is from today. Right? Is Frank muted, or am I just not hearing him?
No, I pulled a Scotty. Sorry.
Okay, thought so.
But yeah, this is a problem you're going to have when you're building roads through the mountains like this. The water is going to flow sometimes in ways that are hard to predict, and if you don't get it exactly right the first time, then you're going to have stuff like this happen. Or if the drainage that you built in, thinking that you did cover it all, and maybe you did, maybe what you built just gets overwhelmed, and you end up with a situation like this. So it's unfortunately just what you have to deal with in the mountain when you build roads through the mountains. And this isn't it. It's not just water running off the land. Sometimes the whole land surface, the whole hillside comes down onto the road that you built, and that's one of the things that could have happened in this situation. It didn't, but when you loosen the soil by putting so much water into it, it runs the risk of coming loose, and you get a landslide that also can shut your roads down and maybe take out a home or two along the way, sometimes even people in it.
Yeah, we know from radar estimates that this was highly localized, and we can show you here on radar scope what the radar was estimating the rainfall amounts to be. But you can see right here, that red area, if you're watching with us on Facebook or YouTube, that is about 2.5 inches of rain, and I-40 is right in the middle of that. So if you're listening on our audio podcast, we're looking at a relatively small area of the country, of this region that was impacted, but that heaviest rainfall was right there on the interstate. And even if it wasn't, the way the terrain flows down towards the interstate, you said overwhelmed, Frank, and I think that was a key word. I think that's exactly what happened here.
And that was 2.5 inches in an hour, right? You had that.
I think it was 2 inches in half an hour. Yeah.
I don't think there's any modeling that can necessarily get you out of that.
In 15 minutes. That's an inch in about 10 minutes.
That is like a week's worth of rain.
Yeah.
Blink of an eye.
That's the gully washer, to say the least.
Yeah. So if you are traveling through this region, you're going to need to once again find an alternative route. And I will admit that I'm sure those sentences and these pictures bring back unwanted memories less than a year after Helene, because I will tell you, just looking at these pictures, I'm like, if I didn't know any better, that could have been 10 months ago.
I think my first reaction, James, when I heard that I-40 was closed, I was like, oh God, not again.
Yeah.
What occurred to me was, imagine I had to pass through there in my little Honda Fit with about 7.5 inches of ground clearance, and just coming up to that and suddenly having to nope it, and probably, getting hit from behind because of that.
And what is it? 6 inches of flowing water can pick up a vehicle? Or something like that, right?
A couple of inches if it's flowing fast. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear 6 is usually what we say, but I mean, in a Honda Fit. I mean, I can't imagine that.
It's even less than a Honda Fit.
On the low end of that for sure. I mean, that's great car. Don't get me wrong, but
no
not what I would
complaints.
want to take.
Great gas mileage, and it's never given me any trouble. But
Yeah,
you wouldn't want to drive it through more than a couple of inches of water.
No, you're not going to ford the river in that. Absolutely
No,
not.
and
we'll drown the oxen.
We know cities like Charlotte, cities like Columbia, Greenville, and that's just to name 3 that are coming to mind off the top of my head, have had flash flooding of their own kind in the past week or so. And so we are seeing in this time frame we're in right now, these thunderstorms that are popping up with lots of humidity in the air. There's lots of moisture available. And in the case of at least what we saw here in Charlotte in the past week, we had a thunderstorm that just didn't move and dumped 5 inches of rain. It was crazy. Frank, we have a severe weather threat as we look ahead to tomorrow, Thursday. What do we need to worry about?
Well, primarily damaging wind is going to be the concern here. We have a cold front that's moving in, and that's out over the plains and Midwest right now, causing some severe weather, actually going east into Ohio and Kentucky right now. That front moves into the eastern seaboard area tomorrow, and that's going to result in thunderstorms blowing up once again. And there's just a wide area that you can see extends all the way from the Charlotte metro area all the way up into the northeastern megalopolis there, where the slight risk level 2 of 5 is in effect for tomorrow. A little bit further south and going west across the deep south, we see the risk for the level 1 risk. But yeah, James has our future radar here from the HER showing a line of thunderstorms, locally gusty winds coming through Thursday afternoon and evening. And again, primary concern is damaging wind. It could be fairly widespread in North Carolina and even more so potentially up into Virginia and toward the Mason-Dixon line. Further south into South Carolina, the risk is going to be less, but certainly going to be there. Tornado risk is very low this time, but you never want to say never. There is a modest amount of shear in North Carolina, and if you're traveling north into Virginia along, say, I-81, get used to going slow behind truckers passing each other at a half mile per hour, one faster than the other. But also having to deal with these damaging winds and hail, and it's a slight chance for an isolated tornado, but not a very good one.
My parents have a flight out of Charlotte. It was supposed to be at 8 o'clock tomorrow. And just to show you where we are in the future cast, 8 o'clock tomorrow is right there, just as that line is set up along the I-85 corridor. And it's a Southwest flight. So they were going to connect in Baltimore. And they looked at this and went, yeah, no.
That looks like a real party. Charlotte to Baltimore and that.
I would say, and I know my mom's listening to this, I would say I think part of their decision was experience, but also really recent experience where when we had that flash flooding in Charlotte last week and we had 50 aircraft lined up waiting for gates during a ground stop at Charlotte. My sister was on one of those flights for hours on the tarmac. And I think they looked at this future cast and went, yeah, we're not doing that twice in a week. Yeah. Nope. She was trying to come to Charleston, Jared, of all places.
Oh,
my sister flew from Albany to Charlotte and then Charlotte to Charleston, but she sat on the tarmac in Charlotte so long we could have driven her to Charleston.
Yeah, that probably would have been the better bet.
Well, sure, if we had gotten her off the plane, which was somewhere on a taxiway.
That's an issue too. Yeah, generally they don't like it when you go up and knock on the door of the plane.
They do not.
No.
So yeah, we'll keep an eye on those storms and the heat. The heat is. Ooh. Take it from a guy who's got HVAC companies coming tomorrow to give me quotes. Could I have picked a worse time of year? I can't imagine what the surge pricing on HVAC is right now.
Oh goodness. Yeah. No, it's not been fun. It's not been fun. You know, we've been getting to our what used to be our heat advisory criteria of 105. That's since gone up to 108 a couple years ago, but still been, very warm. I took a walk this morning and it was already like 81 and the dew point was 78. And I saw James Island had or Johns Island rather, the Charleston Executive Airport there had a dew point of 81 at one point. Now that might be a little hot, but I also kind of believe it. It's yeah, yeah. We wanted summer. Yay, summer! Here it
Here
is.
it is.
Yeah, it's coming. Yeah, we got some fairly intense heat coming our way next week for sure.
Yeah.
We're on the southern edge of the heat dome. It could actually be even worse with the worst of the heat going over the top and into the Mid Atlantic next week. But still, we'll get a taste of it. No fun. I see the Weather Service for Monday has 99 here in Columbia for a high.
Famously hot.
I think did I see European data wants to do like 105 next week? And I'm like, no, thanks.
Yeah. Those 2-meter temperatures. They sometimes are put it mildly out to lunch, but. On the other hand, it's something to think about. It's going to be pretty hot.
Yeah, it's an impressive ridge.
Going to be hot. Yeah, and I think all of the rain that my lawn has been enjoying is going to not be there. I think that heat dome is going to probably cut that off. Take some questions from folks who are watching live with us on the Carolina Weather Group Facebook and YouTube. Jay asks, has there ever been a Carolina Weather Group episode without James Brierton? No hate to you, James. Yes.
I can think of one, at least. Yeah,
just one?
I did an episode with Chris Jackson, just me and him one time on the April 13th, 2020 tornado outbreak.
Yeah.
It has happened.
I hope Jay's not saying he talks a lot, because I do sometimes feel like I talk a lot, Jay. I do feel like it.
Well, you do talk a lot, but you don't babble or anything. You're actually saying useful things.
Yeah. But yes, there have been, and I think there have been even stretches of time where after my children were born, I was gone for a little while. So, those do exist, but they're my least favorite episodes.
Well, and then counting all the time that the Carolina Weather Group existed before any of us were here.
This is also true. Scotty Powell is the only remaining original member. And those we showed clips from our Gary England interview. I wasn't on that because I don't think I was even on the show yet.
No, it was a very different panel.
Yeah. Jay says, no worries. I'm more of the one with the babbling myself. Well, I must have at least a little bit of babbling because I think it's a prereq in order to get a podcast. You have to be able to babble.
No, that's absolutely it.
Yeah. We've got somebody watching from Centerville, Tennessee, and they are under a tornado warning right now. So it must be the one and only tornado warning we have in Tennessee right now, which is just south of Nashville. If I can get this up on the screen,
Duck River, Tennessee.
Ah, there it is. Oh yeah, look, there's Centerville. I will say, as a guy who does a lot of driving through Virginia, that is always the Centerville that comes to mind for me. No disrespect to the Centerville of Tennessee. I now know that you're there. So yeah, that's one of several tornado warnings we've had today. I know you guys were just mentioning this line, which it does stretch essentially from here all the way up to Cleveland. We had a tornado just before we came on. There was a tornado warning heading towards Cleveland. I don't know if it ever actually hit the city of Cleveland, the actual polygon, but it was approaching it. I will say, I mean, look at all this heavy rain right now that's coming into Pittsburgh. This region does not need any more rain. There has been
it's rained a lot up there. I was
deadly flash flooding.
That part of the country's had a good bit of rain.
We know that there have been deaths in West Virginia, which does in fact kind of sneak, right up on in here. That's a broad approximation of where West Virginia's little panhandle is. And so, yeah, they don't need any more rain. This is a quick moving line, but I'm sure there's pretty heavy rainfall rates.
James, if you take my video, I've got the national up, and you can pretty well see. Yeah, that's quite a cyclone going through there, and that's been a severe threat that's been moving out of Montana and through the Dakotas, and now has reached the East Coast. And that's actually going to be a little bit of what we could, we're going to be on kind of the tail end of that tomorrow.
Yeah. And actually what happens with that activity tonight over to our west is going to have an impact on what happens with us tomorrow, because if that generates a convectively driven pool of cool air that's over us tomorrow, then that could result in the storms kind of struggling here over the Carolinas tomorrow afternoon.
So
that's scale meteorology fun.
Always something. We will have real-time severe weather alerts streaming for you on our Carolina Weather Net, which streams on our Carolina Weather Group YouTube channel. So if you're not already subscribed, you can go ahead and check that out. Make it one of the ways you get severe weather warnings by streaming that wherever you watch YouTube, from your smartphone to your smart TV. And I will just tease that some of you have recently signed on as a YouTube member. Some of you have joined us on Patreon. We owe you a quarterly behind-the-scenes live chat. And when we do, we're going to talk about some of the things we're working on for the next iteration of the Carolina Weather Net. It's going to be pretty exciting.
You might have just seen a sneak peek of that.
There is a small Easter egg on that graphic. And I would be really impressed if anybody found it. But this is true. So we're coming up on the end of this week's show. But I hope that you join us for future shows right here every Wednesday night on the Carolina Weather Group YouTube and Facebook, or wherever it is you listen to your audio podcast. Let me scroll the wonderful names of those folks who do help make this show possible, because upgrading computers, buying new lights, paying for Zoom subscriptions, those things do cost money. And then this is a list of some of the people who help make that happen.
Round of applause.
There you go. Couldn't have said it better myself. So thanks again to our guests this week, Craig Fugate, and our panel, Jared Smith in Charleston, South Carolina, Frank Strait in Columbia, South Carolina. I'm James Brierton in Charlotte, North Carolina. We will talk to you again real soon. Be well.